Thank you, Frankie. Thank you, David, for the opportunity to come and speak to you today about Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you all for coming on a cold, wintry night. This lecture is going to be sort of at 1 foot in the 20th century and 1 foot in the 21st century by way of technology. The end of the lecture, I'm going to use some slides that I took when I was in Baltimore, and we'll talk about that, why Baltimore is so important here, at the end of this lecture. But to begin the lecture, I'm going to go back to relying on some old overheads that I'm still making the transition into getting them into JPEGs. So that's why I say 1 foot in the 20th century, 1 foot in the 21st century. Okay, so what if I were to begin by asking you, and I know this is unconventional, but I'm kind of an unconventional guy. What if I were to begin by asking you, when you hear the name Edgar Allan Poe, what comes to mind?
Ravens.
The Raven, of course. The Raven comes to mind immediately, right? The Raven's, and it's not by accident that the Raven should come to mind. You understand. Let's begin by going to where we should be this weekend, the NFL playoffs. The Baltimore Ravens are called the Baltimore Ravens because of Edgar Allan Poe. And in fact, there are two mascots that the Ravens have, Edgar and Allan, that actually are out on the field. So if you keep your eye open when Baltimore plays this weekend, you'll be able to see Edgar and Allan. Also, this might be interesting to you too, that before the play actually begins in the Raven Stadium, they put the Raven, the poem, up on the scoreboard on the Jumbotron. Which yes, it's true. Which I think is one of the great things about, Baltimore Ravens. They're my second favorite team, okay? For reasons that you now understand. Okay, so the Raven comes to mind immediately. The last 2 years, the Raven was published in 1845. And it really was the one work that stood out in the Poe canon. In so many ways, it stood out critically because people found it interesting and they were drawn to it, but it also stood out in terms of money. This was finally something Poe published that actually was making money. And Poe went on the lecture circuit after the publication of the Raven. Poe died in 1849, about 4 years after the publication of the Raven. But during those 4 years, Poe finally had a little bit of money for the first time in his life. And he began, and I think this was part of the showmanship that Poe really professed, he began to dress entirely in black, even when he was living in South Carolina and Richmond, and his nickname became the Raven. So every time he would do a lecture, and I don't know how many of you are already aware of this, forgive me if I'm telling you something you already know. Poe, after publishing The Raven in 45 to almost immediate success, Poe wrote an essay called The Poetic Principle. And he also wrote an essay called The Philosophy of Composition. And the Philosophy of Composition was Poe's attempt to explain the writing of The Raven. And all of this was an attempt on Poe's part to say, hey, you're paying attention at last. But we'll talk about that a little bit more if you want to. So you think of the Raven. What else do you think of when I use his name, Edgar Allan Poe?
Telltale Heart.
The Telltale Heart. Yeah, one of his classic short stories, right? Scary, Halloween. You think of all these things when you think of Poe. Stephen King. Stephen King's debt to Poe is huge. It's absolutely huge. In fact, I had the occasion about 6 or 7 years ago to interview Stephen King, and I asked him about Poe. And one of the things he said was, well, yeah, there were the Telltale Heart and the Raven, they're there, and they find their way into my work. But it was really the Poe pictures, and he used that word, the Poe pictures, that found the greatest influence on his mind and on his sensibility. Those films that were made of Poe, and there are over 100 films that have been made of Edgar Allan Poe's work, beginning with early stuff like in the 1920s when film was just in its nascent form, Films like The Raven, a French film by the director Epstein of The Fall of the House of Usher in 25. Early films of Poe that are now lost to us, which I think is really interesting. Because, of course, they were early, they were done on celluloid that wasn't able to maintain itself for very long, and just crumbled. You know, where a lot of early films began, and Poe really was part of that early film generation. Okay, so you think of those things, you think of terror, you think of Stephen King. Anything else? Yes?
I think of alcoholism.
You think of alcoholism. Interesting. Why would you say you think of alcoholism?
Well, because I've heard that he was an alcoholic. And I think he was a tad bit crazy, too.
That's something for us to think about for a couple of minutes here. Poe's alcoholism and Poe's lunacy.
Well, his general instability.
His instability.
I mean, the very myth that he was buried under the streets of Baltimore.
Yeah.
And he just seemed like vaporized or something. He just didn't have a really steady place.
Yeah, he was. I mean, to use the word unstable is a good start there with Poe.
And yet he was an important literary critic in the area.
All of this.
That sounds like a contradiction.
That he was an important literary critic?
Yeah.
Really a forerunner of new criticism. You know, with his attention, his close attention to text, and the need to separate text from all the other things that were out there to distract. Movements, history, the author, really one of the first new critics, which is interesting because the new critics primarily came from the South, Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, and they identified with Poe as being a Southerner. That Poe connection. So the more you study Poe, the more you do research on Poe, the more you realize everybody wants a piece of Poe. Everybody wants to claim Poe. There are about half a dozen cities on the East Coast that want to claim Poe. He was born in Boston, spent 10 years at a cottage at Fordham University, lived in Philadelphia for a while, died in Baltimore, lived in Richmond and South Carolina. I'm trying to think of where in South Carolina. Probably on the coast. Charleston, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. They all want to claim Poe. All these cities. What did you say? Hilton Head, yeah. Hilton Head before you went fishing and boating. Yeah, when it was just an island.
No, and yet a lot of this bad read. The student of the fellow who executed his will. And,
Did you hear this lecture already?
boned up on it. Edgar Allan Poe.
I got nothing more to say, folks. I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave. Some of the issues that this young woman brought up, Poe's alcoholism, Poe's psychological instability, many of these issues were fomented by a viperous individual by the name of Rufus Griswold. Now, just let the consonants roll off your tongue here. Rufus Griswold. Rufus Griswold was ostensibly a friend of Poe. And in fact, he wrote, he was an editor of a collection of poems called Poets of the United States that came out, I'm tempted to say 1841. Now, Poe was a literary critic. There were a lot of different Poes. There was Poe the horror writer, Telltale Heart. There was Poe the poet, The Raven. Poe started off as a poet, almost exclusively. He wanted to be a poet. Even though he only wrote about 60 poems during his lifetime, he realized he couldn't make a living at this. So he had to give up poetry and start writing prose fiction that would make money, because he could sell them to magazines. He could sell his fiction to magazines. He was also a literary critic, one of the first great literary critics of the country. okay? And he was the inventor of the detective story with Dupin, Auguste Dupin from Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter, stories that I'm sure you've heard of someplace back in that literary memory of yours. But Rufus Griswold, let's come back to him. Rufus Griswold edited this book called Poets in the United States, 1841, and Poe wrote a review of this book. Now, you should know this. Poe could be absolutely vicious as a literary reviewer. My understanding of Poe is that, well, he was not a nice man. Frequently not a nice man. Especially when he'd been drinking, he was not a nice man. But he earned the reputation. Poe wrote over 250 reviews of books, essays, collections of. He wrote reviews of everything. Reviews of books on bunions and calluses. I mean, he was everywhere. He wrote reviews of travelogues, all sorts of stuff. Part of this was that encyclopedic nature that Poe had, but part of it also was Poe needed to make a living. And unlike Hawthorne, who went off to become one of those figures that, I'm trying to think of the name of it, that supplied tariffs, he was Custom House, thank you. Who took care of Custom House work, or Melville, who was, of course, a sailor. Poe was one of those figures who was connected exclusively to the literati. And this is what Poe wanted to do his entire life and spent his entire life doing. But at any rate, back to Rufus Griswold. Poe wrote a nasty review. Griswold didn't take it well. And for some reason, and I don't have an explanation for you here, and none of Poe's biographers have an adequate explanation for this either. For some reason, Poe made Rufus Griswold his literary executor. And this is after Poe tried to borrow money from him in the early 1840s, and Griswold said no. This is after Poe tried to, when his wife Virginia Clym died in 1846, when she died, 47. When she died in 47, Poe was trying to attract another woman by the name of Whitman, and Rufus Griswold wrote her a scurrilous letter about Poe's reputation. Okay? This is even after all of these things. Poe still had him be his literary executor. I suspect, and this is just a gut feeling, I suspect that the reason for that is because there were so few people that Poe trusted, and there were so few people at the end of Poe's life who liked Poe. We're talking about a funeral that consisted of about this many people. When Poe died October 7th, 1849, but among the mourners was Walt Whitman. Isn't that interesting? You would think these two people would be so far apart from each other. And yet Whitman sensed the power here, sensed the genius. But Rufus Griswold, when Poe died in 1949, wrote a series of, well, I guess I would call them reports, literary, I wouldn't call them eulogies. I would call them more like slanderous and libelous acts against Edgar Allan Poe. For example, he accused Poe of being not only a drunkard, but also of being a drug addict. He accused Poe of being a thief, of stealing money wherever he could, that Poe was psychologically unstable, and thus was more, when he wrote these characters who were seething with energy and psychological torment, that what he was really revealing was a kind of autobiographical mirror. And he just went on to defame Poe's reputation. And he published these things in fairly large newspapers. Unfortunately, it stuck. And for many years, Poe's reputation languished in the United States because of Rufus Griswold. and the things that Rufus Griswold had to say. And that's why I asked you to start today's lecture. When you think of Edgar Allan Poe, what do you think of? And it's very interesting that you brought up the alcoholism. Sir?
Just something a little, perhaps, positive. I know that, well, we've all heard negative, but even early on, like Rainier Maria Rilke, the German poet, said in the letter to, in Letters to a Young Poet, he says, we must be like the man who feels out the dungeon walls in the darkness.
Okay.
Even if we're in pain and darkness, we have to know. Like I think it was the Pit and the Pendulum. He was rubbing, yeah, it was Pit and the Pendulum. He was rubbing the
Sure.
walls and feeling it. He couldn't see, but he wanted to know his dungeon. And Rilke said that's how we should be when we are alone or solitary or depressed. Know your darkness, your solitude.
So what you're suggesting here is that in spite of what Rufus Griswold had to say about Poe,
Yeah, I mean, this was like 1904, 1906. This was
Sure.
still early on, and Rilke was not in the least, I guess, affected by the negative criticism. He thought Poe had an excellent example.
that's exactly right. But I'm going to take you back even further,
Oh, okay.
before Rilke, to talk about how literary Europe dealt with this. But to get there, the first thing I have to do is to probably say something about Poe's reputation in America. It was bad. It was bad. First of all, there was the Griswold stuff. Okay? Then there was Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great transcendentalist, who called Poe the Jingle Man. Yeah, this is a guy who wanted to be a poet, right? The Jingle Man. Whitman had this respect. Emily Dickinson refused to read him, even though she probably had more in common with Poe than anybody else. You know, with this obsession with death, psychological torment, all of these things. Hawthorne, Poe loved Hawthorne. Poe really found in Hawthorne a lot of the same emphasis on psychological interiority that you find in Poe. But in fact, Poe wrote two very, very powerful reviews of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales. Two of them, just to indicate the connection that these two had. But Hawthorne kind of kept his distance from Poe. It's interesting that Hawthorne never wrote anything about Poe. Poe had these kinds of adoration with certain novelists and writers. Hawthorne, Dickens is probably the best example. He adored Dickens. And he interviewed Dickens twice for newspaper articles that Poe was writing. And he begged Dickens, please get me published in England, somewhere. And Dickens tried, no go. He respected Longfellow, but he also hated Longfellow because Longfellow was a Harvard professor making money at Harvard and making money off of his poetry. And nothing upset Poe more than that kind of success. Because Poe was going nowhere. All of his life he was going nowhere when it came to those kinds of successes. So poor Poe's dead. The reputation that we've got is this guy who, in many ways, was a hack. That's how he was viewed. During his lifetime, except for a few people like Walt Whitman, and then posthumously, within this country, he was viewed as psychologically unstable, a drug addict, an alcoholic. Rufus Griswold did his work well. Poe was not a drug addict. There is absolutely no evidence that Poe was addicted to any drugs other than alcohol. And he was a very serious alcoholic. Okay? But then, name me an American writer that wasn't. Poe was the first in a long line of great American drunks. That said, Poe was dealing with this reputation. Poe's history was dealing with this reputation. And I would suggest to you that were it not for the French, where are you? Where are you, Frankie? Were it not for the French, that Poe's reputation would have languished probably up to our own time. Because the Americans were just not interested in Poe. Well, think of what was going on in 1849 in this country. What comes to mind immediately? Let's break out of it. The slavery issue, and Poe had real ambivalent feelings about the slavery issue. The southern part of Poe said, hey, this is our business. Poe was not one of the great abolitionists like Thoreau, the Transcendentalist. He was not an abolitionist. He was more of in connection with the South. So there was that issue. What else was going on in 1849 in this country? The goal of that movement west, right? Exploration. This Emersonian expansionism, right, that characterized mid-19th century Jacksonian politics. Poe was not a fan of Jacksonian politics. Okay? So there was this movement west, there was this movement out, colonialism, pre-colonialism, with the expansion into the oceans. Melville is probably the best example. Moby Dick, Marty, Typee, those South Sea tales. Emersonian movement west. And what do you got in Poe? You've always got this sense of movement in rather than out. You know, into a room, into a psyche, into some sort of tight configuration, almost claustrophobic. If you think of those great tales, even The Raven's a good example. If you think of those great tales that you remember from your youth, the Cask of Amontillado, the Telltale Heart, the Black Cat, the Mask of the Red Death, all of these stories are essentially about containment. It's a premature burial. They're all about this sense of containment. And they're also about this sense of movement down rather than out. And the Cask of Amontillado is a good example, but every one of these stories really starts up here and moves down, whether it's into a crypt, Fall the House of Usher, or it's into a house, or it's into a psyche. You know, physical space in Poe, and he inherited this from the Gothic, that generation just before him. Physical space in Poe is always a barometer to psychological condition. So why would America be interested in this guy? He was a freak. But not for the French. Oh no, not for the French. The French adored him. How would I say this, Frankie? Le Français t'adore.
Les Français l'adorent et les Français adorent Poe.
There you go. There you go. All right. So, Rufus Griswold did his work, but the French did not listen. Vive la France! Right? And we have especially this Frenchman, Charles Baudelaire, maybe one of the most important writers in the 19th century in any language. But Baudelaire read English, and he read Poe, and he spent 20 years translating Poe into French. He wrote the first biography of Poe that was published in 1857, okay? And these other poets, symbolist poets, all French, right? Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Valeret. Valeret did Poe's essays, translated all of Poe's essays into French. Mallarmé did the poetry. Baudelaire did the prose. 20 years doing this. Even as he's writing Fleur de Mal, which is 1861, he's in the midst of publishing work on Poe, translations of Poe. Okay? Now, why is this important? Well, the combination of all these translations that began in 56 and went all the way to 75, the combination of all these translations plus that biography in 57 changed Poe's reputation in the eyes of literary Europe. Okay? Now, how did it change Poe's reputation? Well, first of all, a lot of people began reading the French translations. Dostoevsky read English, but he also read French. He was fluent in French and English. And he read Poe, he was alerted to Poe through these translations. It was through the French that Poe disseminated into Europe. And suddenly, his reputation was buried in America. But in 19th century Europe, it was reborn. So what we see here is the beginning of a movement. if you will, that ended in the symbolist poets of the 19th century, okay? And I have to go over here. The Pre-Raphaelites, Rossetti, Swinburne, Beardsley, Wilde, all of them fascinated with Poe. When I say to you that Poe is probably arguably the most important author that this country ever produced, I mean that not only in terms of the work that he did, but also his reputation and the way he influenced other people. There is no writer in this country that influenced the rest of the world the way Poe has. Not to the range, not to the depth, not in the scope that Poe has. He's our Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare of the lunatic asylum, maybe. But he's still our Shakespeare in terms of the impact that Poe had on the rest of the world. And it starts with the French, but it also goes all the way to Russia with Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky translated Poe into Russian. He was the first translator Poe had in Russian, and I think he started with things like the double, when he was working with the double stories that Poe wrote. Particularly, I'm drawing a blank on this. Oh God, William Wilson. Thank you. Thank God you're here. William Wilson, which prefigured Dostoevsky's own novel, The Double. But there were all of these incredibly interesting things that were happening in the early 60s in Dostoevsky, and of course if you wanted to talk about Raskolnikov, the hero of Crime and Punishment, Raskol in Russia means split. And how many of Poe's narrators are these split personalities who go out, commit a crime, and then feel compelled to be punished for what they've done? Think of The Telltale Heart or The Black Cat. So too with Raskolnikov. The sense of space in Crime and Punishment, for instance, is also interesting. Dostoevsky probably inherited a lot of that from Poe. But if I go back to Baudelaire and the French, which is a good place for us to continue a little longer, what Baudelaire found particularly attractive about Poe was his total rejection of the criticism that Rufus Griswold had raised. For Baudelaire, the fact that Poe was a drunkard and that Poe was addicted possibly to drugs were pluses. This was a sign of somebody who had separated themselves from bourgeois capitalist culture. And for Baudelaire, and you begin to see where this has its roots in the movement towards modernism, in the sense that Poe became the figure of the artist par excellence. And by that, I mean, I'm speaking in terms of the romantic artist, the concept of the romantic artist who has to suffer for his work and will never be appreciated. I've often talked to students about the connection between Edgar Allan Poe and Vincent van Gogh. That's an interesting parallel. Van Gogh knew Poe's work because Van Gogh also read English. So Van Gogh read Poe's work, and that sense of the artist feeling estranged, feeling impoverished, not only in terms of other people understanding his work, but also in terms of money. The parallels are very interesting here between Van Gogh and Poe. And you can see why Van Gogh was drawn to him. He should also be included up here as well with that list. But most importantly, the sense of defining the artist as a figure who it was difficult to understand, who suffered tremendously, who didn't have a place in the contemporary society, and whose work would only be understood later by another generation that was still to come. Certainly Van Gogh felt that, at certain points, especially when his hope for an artist community fell apart with Gauguin's leaving 2 years before Van Gogh committed suicide and just before he went into the asylum. There would have been that sense in Van Gogh of, I'm totally alone in this enterprise, but someday there's going to be somebody's going to see this work. Somebody's going to understand this work. And I suspect Poe had a similar sense of this, that his work would only be appreciated later on, after he was gone. And that certainly is the case. When I use the word modernism, that's really important. If I had a blackboard here, I'd put the word flaneur up there on the blackboard. Flaneur is a French term that Baudelaire coined. And he coined it about a French painter by the name of Guy, G-U-Y. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
G-U-Y?
G-U-I, Guy. And what Baudelaire viewed, this is from a book called The Painter in Modern Life. Baudelaire viewed the flaneur as an urban figure, an urban male, who was both in and out of the action that was going on around him. Now, if you study Impressionist painting, particularly the work of Degas and Manet, you will see this image of the flaneur often. He's a figure who's almost always dressed in black. He's bourgeois gentleman, and usually he's looking for women. And he's always on the perimeter of the painting. The Folies Bergère is a good example of the flaneur, standing there both in and out of the painting. There's a figure of him. But if you looked at some of these paintings, and if we had more time, we'd bring out some of those Impressionists, and I could show you this. Baudelaire also saw the flaneur in Poe. He understood that all through Poe's work there are these figures, and that's why I'm talking about modernism here. There are these urban figures that move in Poe. A Man of the Crowd is probably the best example. These figures that are anonymous because they're in the stream of urban world and urban life. And that anonymity gives them a sense of being part of all of this, but also being separated from this. And if you think of C. Auguste Dupin, Poe's detective, got a pretty interesting example of the flaneur there. The detective who is both part of the action, but also able to separate himself from it too. So Baudelaire also saw Poe in this line to modernism. Now T.S. Eliot was a great admirer of Baudelaire, but he just couldn't stand Poe. He couldn't understand why Baudelaire devoted 20 years of his life to Edgar Allan Poe, because for T.S. Eliot, Poe was just, I'm trying to think of the phrase Eliot used, and a writer for adolescents. That's what he called him. But it's really interesting that other modernists were drawn to Poe, like Hart Crane, for instance, in The Bridge. Poe is one of the great figures in that poem. He's one of the great figures that nails that poem down. And I would suggest to you that all through the 20th century, Poe comes back into play through literary Europe. Okay? Now, let me show you just a couple of these. And again, I apologize that they're not on PowerPoint, but next time you hear this lecture, they will. This is one of Manet's pen and ink drawings of the Raven. This was executed probably early 70s, 1870, and Manet actually did about 6 of these, all in charcoal. My book, The Approaches to Teaching, what was that again? Approaches to Teaching the Prose and Poetry.
Oh, your title?
Yeah, the title of it again.
Yeah, mine is
Speak into the mic.
Teaching Prose, Prose, and Poetry.
That's a real mouthful. One of the cover art is one of Manet's charcoal sketches of the Raven. He did about 6 or 7 of these. Really great stuff. And here's Aubrey Beardsley, The Black Cat in the Fall of the House of Usher. I don't know how many of you know who Aubrey Beardsley is. He was a dirty little man. He also did drawings for the Marquis de Sade, and lots of penises and things going on in his painting, in his drawings. But he was very fascinated with Poe, and did several of these. Show you some more work that came out. This is a little later. These are in the 30s. Redans to Edgar Allan Poe. I'm wondering if, when he did this, he wasn't thinking also of Poe's great story, The Balloon Hoax, that Poe wrote early in his career, where he actually, projected this fantasy about crossing the transatlantic travel through a balloon. And of course, Poe treated it like it was an actual event, like a newspaper recording. It was like that guy who set up the bubble. What was the name of that? Recently, the silver thing? What was it, the baby bubble or boy bubble?
Or the balloon boy.
The balloon boy, thank you. He was like that. He did it just for a hoax, hoping that he could make some money off of this, hoping that people would believe it. It was like H.G. Wells in War of the Worlds. And Poe was not above doing this at any point. And the balloon hoax really prefigured Balloon Boy. And here's a couple of other things. Edgar Allan Poe, The Mask Sounding the Death Knell. Many of you probably know Poe's famous poem, The Bells. And I think that's what Redon has in mind there. And I wanted to also share early work that was also coming out. Let me remind you at the same time that Poe was being absorbed by the painterly world and the visual arts. He was also the subject of many early works, including, I should show you this. This is even more interesting. This is one of the earliest films that was made. This is The Raven, 1915. This is now a lost film. We do not have this anymore, but notice the spelling there. It's A-L-L-A-N, okay? Because Poe's middle name, or Poe's, that name Allan comes from Francis Allan, who adopted Poe when he was 2 years old. Francis and John Allan in Richmond. And Poe had to take that name. Never got along well with the Allan family except for the wife, Frances. So, that A is always there. And at the end of his life, Poe just started, because he had such a falling out with his stepfather, he just started signing everything Edgar A. Poe. And Baudelaire said, enough of that, we'll just call him Edgar Poe. So we dropped Allan completely out of that. But interesting stuff. And this is, I wanted to share this with you because look at the names on this. Yeah, isn't that great? It's a terrible film. Just a terrible film, but interesting to see that. In the 60s, this is, what is the date on this? This is 63. In the 60s, let me think about this for just a second. Roger Corman. This is a name that many of you probably know through many of the B movies that he made in the 60s. Well, Roger Corman had a period from about 61 to 65, 66, where he did literally 15 Poe films. And this is what Stephen King was referring to when he called them the Poe pictures. These were the Poe pictures that Steve watched when he was a kid. And they're pretty bad. To be honest with you, they were drive-in fare that Roger Corman did. Almost every one of them ends with the same shot of a barn burning. And of course, it's got nothing to do with Poe, but he had that and he liked it, so he kept using it. So Vincent Price, Laurie, Boris Karloff. Here's another one. This is another Poe picture. And you can see down here, see the Roger Corman there? Produced and directed. But also screenplay by Richard Matheson, which is interesting too. Here's the Poe, and I want to draw your name here to not only Vincent Price, because Vincent Price was in every one of these. This was also, The Raven was also Jack Nicholson, that film I just showed you first film that Jack Nicholson did. When he was in The Raven with Vincent Price and Boris Karloff and all those great horror monster guys. But Barbara Steele is a name that you want to Google at some point. Barbara Steele was one of the great Poe actresses of all time. She did a lot of Poe work. And, you know, again, another one of those B actresses here, like so many of Poe's figures, a brunette, an exotic brunette, who had incredible sex appeal more than anything else. And of course, in the 60s, Roger Corman was trying to capitalize on that. But let me go back to this one more time for just a second. If we had more time, I would spend a great deal of energy showing you all of these things and how they all work. But you can begin to see the line that develops here. Poe and the visual arts, we've talked a little bit about Manet's work, but it's also possible to link Vincent van Gogh in there. The Pre-Raphaelites, Beardsley is a good example there. The cinematic influence, 90 films have been made of Poe's work. Poe in music, Claude Debussy, the great French composer, wrote 2 operas that he dedicated to Edgar Allan Poe. And then, of course, as the father of the detective story, you can begin to see where Poe works in terms of the Sherlock Holmes stories, the police procedural. Thomas Harris, a film like Silence of the Lambs, shows all sorts of Poe influences. It's the horror story, but it's also the detective story at the same time. So you've got those kind of connections here. And I teach a course at UVM called Poe's Children, and this is what we study. We spend the first month or so reading Poe, and then I take them into this rich world that Poe helped to invent in tales of ratiocination, but also that Poe pushed forward in science fiction. All of these science fiction writers were very strongly influenced by Poe, but none more than Arthur Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes series. I mean, there's a reason why detective fiction is awarded the Edgar every year. The winner of the detective fiction gets the Edgar because Edgar Allan Poe invented the detective story. So what do we got going here? We got a guy who was able to do many different things. I started this lecture suggesting to you that there were many different Poes. There was Poe the detective writer, there was Poe the horror writer, there was Poe the poet, there was Poe the hoaxer, there was Poe the comic. Oh, I know that sounds weird. Poe wrote as many comic stories, comic sketches, as he did horror. Now, they're very bizarre stories. They're very bizarre comic stories. Like, my favorite one is A Predicament. And it's about a woman who goes to a bell tower. You know, Poe is fascinated with bell towers. She goes to a bell tower, and she sticks her head out of a clock. Poe was also fascinated with clocks. But there's this very large clock surrounding her head, and she gets her head stuck in the clock. And she can't pull her head out of the clock, and the minute hand is coming down. Slower and slower and slower and slower, until finally the minute hand reaches her neck, and she describes her own decapitation. This is comic, yes. This is where, but let me remind you that people like Flannery O'Connor, if you've read Flannery, Good Man is Hard to Find, Good Country People, Flannery O'Connor, one of the great American Southern writers, loved Poe, but not the Poe you guys are talking about. She loved the comic Poe. She read those stories like A Predicament, you know, and you can see where that grotesque sense of humor in Flannery O'Connor comes from. But the point is, eventually, through the French, through the Europeans, through the Russians, Poe comes back to the United States. And in the 20th century, finally, we embrace him as well. And Rufus Griswold finally gets his comeuppance, right? Okay, now, let me turn this off. And there's one last little treat I have for you before I go back to Burlington. David, I think I may need, oh, here it comes. Here it comes. We just got to give this a couple of minutes to warm up, I think. About 6 or 7 years ago, I did a lecture in Baltimore. as I've mentioned to you already, Baltimore was the city where Poe died. Every one of the cities that we've talked about on the East Coast has a Poe society, but none bigger than Baltimore's. Let's see, can I make this bigger?
Do you want to go slide by slide?
Yeah, yeah.
See if you
If you click on the slide, maybe. Okay. There you go. Perfect. Thank you. This is yours truly in front of a national landmark, Poe's first house in Baltimore. He died in Baltimore, but he also lived in Baltimore his early years. This is from 1831 to 1835. He started his career here in this house, and you can see the kind of national landmark side there. This is where Poe wrote Morella, Fall of the House of Usher, early works, Ligeia, but also most of those early poems when Poe was just trying to, he saw himself in a Byronic vein. He was connected to Keats and Byron. Those are his two great influences on his poetry. He especially loved Keats. And he wanted to be Keats. So he started off thinking in terms of, I will be a poet. I will be the American John Keats. Unfortunately, couldn't make a living at it. So this is the house where the poet lived, and this is the house where the poet died. Let's see if I'm going to go over here. Yeah. Okay. That's another side of me, but it's also another side of the Poe house. Now, I should tell you where this is. This is literally in the center of Baltimore. Now, it wasn't when Poe lived there in 1831. This was more the outskirts of Baltimore when Poe lived there. Now, right now, it's ghetto. The house across the street, I should have taken a picture of that too. The house across the street was a crack house without a front door. And I was here on Sunday morning. Well, I thought that was kind of interesting. Given Poe's rep and, the macabre world that Poe wrote about, that this should have devolved into this. But at one point, this was on a Sunday morning, this guy comes up to me and he's clearly high. And he says, "You here for the house?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yeah." and he said, This isn't a very good neighborhood." I said, "Yeah, I see that." And he said, "But we're really glad to have this house here. We really are. No one ever hurts that house." And I said, "You better not. He'll come back and get you." Not too far from this house is the Presbyterian Cemetery where Poe was buried. You can see this is the first gravestone that was put up in Poe's honor. You can see the date, October 9th, 1849. That's not exactly right. He actually died on the 7th, but maybe he was interred on the 9th. I don't know, but that's wrong. But at any rate, this is where Poe first rested, in this graveyard. It's an interesting place. It's again right in the center of the city. There's a hospital right next to it, and you just walk right in there. And this is, of course, the place where that fellow comes every Halloween and leaves a bottle of Amontillado.
Does anyone know for sure of what he died? I read an
You want to talk about that a little bit?
I read an interesting theory that he actually died of rabies.
Yeah, that's right. That theory came out about 3 years ago. I should know the name of the guy who did this, and I have that somewhere. But he came out with a theory because Poe was, suffering from a condition that was similar to what you experienced, symptoms that, like rabies. Poe was, I should begin by telling you, on September 26th, 1849, Poe boarded a stagecoach in Richmond, and ostensibly to go meet with editors in New York City. When Poe left Richmond, he had a fever. We know this for a fact because Poe in 1849 was engaged to a woman named Elmira Royster. And she was one of the first women that Poe pursued when he was a young man, but her father and mother wouldn't let Poe near the house because they saw what was there. But they were gone now, and she was interested again, and she had lost her husband, and Poe had lost Virginia Clem, and so they were dating again. In fact, they were affianced. And she put Poe on the stagecoach, and he was running a high fever. We know that from her. But there's this book called the Poe Log. It's about that big, and it references every day of Edgar Allan Poe's life. Yeah, you should go to the library someday and just have a look at this thing. You know, I've lived with this thing for many years, but it's just unbelievable. Every day of Poe's life has these details in it, except for the last week. Poe literally disappeared off the face of the earth until about October 3rd. Nobody knew. The Poe log has no entries for that week.
He didn't get off the stagecoach?
He got off the stagecoach in Baltimore. And he never made it to New York City. There he was in Baltimore,
Someone saw him off the train.
Don't know that. We don't know what happened to Poe. We know that it was election day, one of those days that he was gone. And we know that Poe was found wearing clothes that were not his own, thoroughly intoxicated, in the bar district of Baltimore. You know, that makes sense, right? That he would have found his way to a tavern. But why the clothes? Some biographers have speculated that Poe was drugged and then made to wear different clothes so that he could vote multiple times for drinks during voting day. But whatever happened, for that week, Poe disappeared, and when he finally was put into the hospital, which is another national landmark that the city of Baltimore is trying to tear down, but the Poe Society will not allow it to happen because Poe died in that hospital. When Poe made it to the hospital, he was almost incoherent. You know, slipping in and out of coma. He kept saying the word Reynolds, Reynolds, Reynolds. Reynolds was a theorist who believed that if you went to the top of the earth, you would find a hole. And you would go inside that hole and you could get to the center of the earth. The Jules Verne vision of the Arcadian world that we existed somewhere in the center of the earth. And Poe was fascinated with all that. Those of you who know his novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, there's something very similar going on with that movement into whiteness that ends the novel. But Poe was always fascinated with this. That's the only coherent thing Poe said the entire time he was there. And all we know about what happened to him at that point is that he was drunk and he was sick, had the symptoms of rabies, but I would also say you could make the argument that he had the symptoms of pneumonia, that he had the symptoms of an advanced tumor. Yeah, I mean, a brain tumor that may have been working, maybe diabetes. You know, a lot of problems that could have happened with Poe at that point, but it's very clear that Poe had a real aversion to alcohol. He had a serious allergy to alcohol. It only took a couple of drinks to put Poe out. And he was not a big man. He was only about 5 feet tall, very thin, very slight, and everywhere Poe went, the bottle was always there. Somebody wanting him to read The Raven, somebody wanting him to get drunk and get up on the table and start performing. But he could also get belligerent too. Poe was arrested for public drunkenness and fighting on several occasions in Philadelphia as well as in, not New York because his wife had him under control, but in Philadelphia and in, I think, what's the other city? I can't remember. But Philadelphia definitely was one of those places that arrested him for public intoxication and fighting in the streets. Okay, this is in front of the law building at the University of Baltimore. And of course it is the statue of Edgar Allan Poe, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dreamed to dream before. And it's a beautiful statue because you see Poe like this, kind of listening. Poe, Poe, as we talked about Poe as a poet, but Poe also understood that the highest art form was music. For Poe, nothing surpassed music. And what he tried to do in using his language, both in the short stories, but especially in the poetry, is to create a kind of rhythm and create a kind of sound within the poetry. And if you listen carefully to poems like The Bells, even The Raven, the sound is what carries these poems more than anything. It's one of the things that I think the French really enjoyed about it, particularly Mallarmé, who translated all of Poe into French, all of Poe's poetry into French. But this is in Baltimore, in front of the law school, which is kind of interesting. And this is finally where Poe rests. His remains rest. This is he was disinterred from that earlier grave I showed you. I think 2 years, maybe 3 years after being placed there, and put over here with the remains of his wife, Virginia Clem, who was also his second cousin, and her mother, Mattie Clem. So they are all here under this great monument to Poe that was, and this is the place that the guy brings the bottle and puts the bottle here every Halloween. And this was a monument that was dedicated to Poe by the French government.
Where is it?
Yeah, this is in Baltimore. This is downtown Baltimore, yes.
How old was Poe when he died?
40. And when you think about the output that this guy produced in 40 years, it's phenomenal. A huge collection of short stories that you're all familiar with, 60 poems, 250 plus reviews of various books and various articles, at least a dozen essays, letters, a novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, a drama that was unfinished. How he found time to get drunk is just baffling to me.
Was he manic? Bipolar?
Could be, yeah. And of course the alcohol would have just pushed that harder. Yeah, could be.
You had two references on your slide of more modern people who've been influenced by him. One was the group 9 Inch Nails.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, what songs, because I could easily see Trent Reznor being interested in him.
Yeah, absolutely right.
But which songs in particular has your research found?
First of all, let me start with Alan Parsons. Alan Parsons, back in the 70s, did an entire album, at least that's what we called it in the 70s, right? An entire album of synthesized music based on Edgar Allan Poe's stories. That there's no voice, though all the voices that you hear in this thing are the voices of a synthesizer. And if you've ever listened to Alan Parsons, that's what he does mostly with his work. And this is a really fascinating thing to read, to listen to. Closed on Account of Rabies is a more recent collection of various artists reading Edgar Allan Poe. Let me think for a minute. Who's in there? Marianne Faithfull reads one of Poe's poems. One of my favorite actors, and I'm drawing a blank. You guys, you have to help me here. He was in, what is his name? Christopher Walken. Thank you. Christopher Walken reads The Raven.
That's awesome.
He reads The Raven. And there are several other people that do wonderful work on Closed on Account of Rabies. But the 9 Inch Nails that I was thinking of were the videos. The videos that he does There are several of them that appear to have all the symbology of Poe's work embedded in them. I can't think of their names right now, but there are at least half a dozen that Nine Inch Nails has made that have, you know, that tortured male figure suffering over the loss of a dead or lost woman. So those were the ones I was thinking of more than anything. But this might be a good time for me to stop and to ask you to join me with some questions or anything you want to talk about.